December 24th, 1844, Williamson County, Tennessee. The earth was frozen solid, but Louisa's hands were warm with purpose. Louisa. That was the name of the woman who, on Christmas Eve, turned a celebration into a graveyard, a feast into a funeral, and 5 men's laughter into eternal silence. The Hartwell plantation stretched across the rolling hills like a scar on the landscape, its white columns gleaming in the winter moonlight. The air tasted of wood smoke and coming snow, of roasted pig and something darker that only Louisa could smell. Something that had been building for 23 years. Louisa May Washington, they called her in the records. 23 years old, 5 feet and 2 inches of quiet observation and careful planning. Her hands bore the calluses of kitchen work, her back the memory of lashes, her eyes the accumulated weight of watching 5 men destroy everything she had ever loved. She moved through the plantation house like a ghost, serving meals, cleaning chambers, invisible to everyone except when they needed something broken or someone blamed. They had trained her to cook their meals, to serve their guests, to smile when they spoke, and lower her eyes when they passed. But tonight, Louisa had learned a different kind of service. Tonight, she would serve justice with the same careful attention she had given their Christmas feast. Thomas Hartwell, James Morrison, William Knox, David Carpenter, Samuel Hayes. These were the names she whispered every morning when she woke, every night when she closed her eyes. The 5 men who had taken turns breaking her spirit, her body, her family. The 5 men who thought Christmas Eve was for celebration. They had no idea that Louisa had been preparing her own kind of Christmas gift. This is the true story of Louisa May Washington, the woman who taught 5 plantation owners that the earth remembers everything, and some debts can only be paid in blood and soil. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The morning had started like every Christmas Eve for the past 10 years. Louisa rose before dawn, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors of the slave quarters. The air was sharp enough to cut, and her breath formed small clouds that disappeared as quickly as her hopes once had. She dressed in the grey wool dress Mrs. Hartwell had given her, the one with the carefully mended tear along the left shoulder where Master James had grabbed too hard 3 summers ago. The kitchen was her domain, the one place where she held power over flame and blade, seasoning and time. She knew every pot, every pan, every knife by touch alone. The cast-iron Dutch oven that could hold enough stew to feed 20 men. The carving knife that could separate bone from joint with surgical precision. The heavy wooden spoon that had stirred 1,000 meals and would stir 1 more. The feast was planned for sunset. 5 plantation owners from neighboring properties, their wives safely tucked away at Christmas parties in Nashville, leaving the men to their annual tradition of cards, whiskey, and stories they wouldn't tell in polite company. Stories about property that walked on 2 legs and screamed when you broke it. Louisa had been preparing this meal for weeks. Not just the Christmas feast they expected, but the other meal, the one that would feed the earth itself. She moved through her morning routine with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Check the fires, count the place settings, sharpen the knives, test the rope. Everything had to be perfect. The other house slaves gave her space. They always had. There was something about Louisa that made people step aside, made conversations quiet when she passed. Maybe it was the way she never spoke unless spoken to, never complained, never cried. Maybe it was the way she watched everything with those dark eyes that seemed to catalogue each cruelty, each injustice, filing them away like recipes she might cook someday. Sarah had tried to befriend her once. Sweet Sarah with the gap-toothed smile and hands gentle enough to birth foals. Sarah who had whispered warnings about Master Thomas's moods and Master James's wandering hands. Sarah who had held Louisa the night they sold her boy Moses down to Alabama. But Sarah was gone now. Sold last spring when she got pregnant again, and Master Thomas decided he had too many mouths to feed. The last Louisa had heard, Sarah was picking cotton in Mississippi, her new baby buried in Delta soil before it saw its first harvest. Sarah. Moses. Little Ruth, who had coughed herself to death in the lean-to behind the smokehouse. Old Ben, who had been whipped to death for looking Master William in the eye. Her mother, Rebecca, who who had died giving birth to a baby that looked too much like Master Samuel for anyone's comfort. They were all there in the kitchen with her as she worked, their names carved into her memory deeper than any brand, their faces clearer than any mirror. They whispered encouragement as she tested the weight of the carving knife, as she checked the strength of the rope she had been braiding from hemp for the past 6 months. The guests began arriving as the sun touched the horizon. She watched from the kitchen window as they rode up the circular drive, their horse's breath steaming in the cold air. 5 men who owned everything they could see and most of what they couldn't. 5 men who had never worked a day with their hands, never felt the bite of hunger, never wondered if tomorrow would bring a beating or a sale. Thomas Hartwell dismounted first, his belly straining against his vest, his face red from whiskey and winter wind. He was the worst of them, the one who smiled when he hurt people, who made games of other people's pain. He had owned Louisa since she was 12, had watched her grow from child to woman with the calculating gaze of someone appraising livestock. James Morrison followed, tall and thin as a scarecrow, with hands that moved too quickly and eyes that never stayed still. He was the clever one, the one who found new ways to make profit from misery. It was James who had suggested selling the children separately from their mothers. More money that way, he said. Market demand. William Knox, David Carpenter, Samuel Hayes. Each one carried the weight of specific crimes, particular cruelties that had shaped Louisa's understanding of justice. William, who had killed old Ben for sport. David, who had sold Moses the day after promising Louisa he could stay. Samuel, who had taken her mother and left behind only blood and a baby who never drew breath. They gathered in the dining room, their voices loud with anticipation and aged bourbon. The mahogany table gleamed under candlelight, set with the plantation's finest china, silver that had been polished until it caught every flicker of flame. Crystal glasses that rang like tiny bells when touched, waiting to be filled with wine that cost more than most people earned in a year. Louisa served the first course in perfect silence. Oyster soup from the Chesapeake, delivered that morning packed in ice. She ladled it into bowls with steady hands, her face a mask of servile attention. When Master Thomas complimented the seasoning, she nodded and smiled the way she had been trained to do. When Master James grabbed her wrist as she served, she didn't flinch. But she remembered, just like she remembered everything else. The years had taught Louisa patience and planning, and the kind of careful observation that came from being invisible. She had learned to read the signs that meant trouble was coming. The way Master Thomas's jaw tightened when the cotton prices dropped. The way Master James's fingers drummed the table when he was calculating cruelties. The way they all looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She had been 11 when they first brought her to Hartwell Plantation. Sold away from her mother's arms in Virginia, packed into a wagon with 6 other children like sacks of grain. The journey had taken 4 days. 4 days of dust and tears, and the growing understanding that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who owned and those who were owned. Her mother, Rebecca, had found her 3 years later. Louisa never learned how, never knew what Rebecca had traded or sacrificed to follow her daughter across state lines. But one morning, there she was in the slave quarters, her face thinner, her hands rougher, but her eyes still holding the fierce love that had sung Louisa to sleep for the first 11 years of her life. For 6 years, they had been together again. 6 years of whispered conversations in the dark, of shared dreams about freedom, of carefully hoarded hope that someday they would walk away from this place together. Rebecca had taught her to read using a Bible stolen from the plantation house, had shown her how to find north by the stars, had filled her head with stories of places where children grew up with their mothers and no one owned anyone else. Then Samuel Hayes had come visiting, and everything changed. Samuel was the youngest of the 5, barely 30, with smooth hands and a smile that made the plantation wives giggle behind their fans. But Louisa saw what they didn't. She saw the way he looked at her mother, saw the calculations behind his pale eyes. She tried to warn Rebecca, tried to tell her to avoid the barn where Samuel liked to conduct his private business. But Rebecca had been protecting her daughter for too long to stop. When Samuel cornered Louisa behind the smokehouse one evening, when his hands started reaching for places they had no right to touch, Rebecca appeared like an avenging angel. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Samuel's pride couldn't tolerate being refused by property, couldn't accept that a slave woman might have the audacity to protect her child. The baby came 10 months later, born screaming into a world that had no place for it. Rebecca bled for 3 days, her life leaking away with each hour while Louisa held her hand and watched Samuel Hayes ride past the window as if nothing had happened. The baby never drew a second breath. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was Rebecca's final gift to her child, sparing it from a life of bondage. But Louisa knew the truth. She knew that Samuel Hayes had killed them both as surely as if he had used a gun. That was when the planning started. Not the hot rage that burned bright and fast, but the cold fury that built slow and steady like winter ice. Louisa buried her mother and her infant sibling in the slave cemetery behind the chapel, marked their graves with stones she painted with berry juice, and began to prepare for the day when debts would be paid in full. She learned every detail of the plantation's operations, where the men kept their money, their weapons, their secrets. She studied their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. She discovered that Master Thomas was afraid of enclosed spaces, that Master James couldn't swim, that Master William had a weak heart that raced when he was frightened. Most importantly, she learned about the old well. The well had been dug 50 years earlier, back when the plantation was smaller and the water table was higher. It was 12 feet deep and lined with fieldstone, hidden now behind the tool shed and covered with rotting boards. The plantation had 2 newer wells closer to the house, so the old one had been abandoned, forgotten by everyone except Louisa. She had been using it to dispose of kiike, itchen scraps and broken crockery for years. Nobody questioned where the refuse went as long as it disappeared. But Louisa knew exactly how deep it was, how narrow, how perfectly shaped for holding things that needed to stay hidden. The Christmas Eve feast had been her idea. She had suggested it to Master Thomas 6 months earlier, playing to his vanity and his love of showing off. A gathering of the most successful planters in the county, she had said. A chance to display the plantation's prosperity and his own generosity. She had even volunteered to prepare the entire meal herself to spare him the expense of hiring additional help. Master Thomas had loved the idea. He spent weeks planning the menu, choosing the wines, polishing the silver. He never noticed that Louisa was making preparations of her own. The laudanum had been easy to obtain. Master Thomas kept it for his rheumatism, a brown bottle in his bedroom dresser that he never counted carefully. Louisa had been stealing small amounts for months, building a supply that would be more than sufficient for 5 men, even men as large as her targets. She knew exactly how much to use. Not enough to kill them quickly, that would be too merciful. Just enough to make them helpless, aware but unable to move, unable to call for help. She wanted them conscious for what came next. She wanted them to understand what was happening and why. The main course was venison roast, perfectly seasoned with herbs from her garden and the bitter powder that would seal their fate. She carved it at the table, her hands steady as stone, her face composed in the expression of humble service they expected. Each slice was perfectly portioned, each plate presented with the careful attention to detail that had made her reputation as the finest cook in the county. They ate with appreciation, complimenting the tenderness of the meat, the richness of the sauce. Master Thomas called for more wine. Master James loosened his collar. Master William pushed back from the table with a satisfied sigh. They were comfortable, content, surrounded by warmth and luxury, and the absolute certainty that they were safe in their own domain. The laudanum worked slowly, creeping through their systems like winter fog. First came the drowsiness, the heavy feeling behind their eyes that they attributed to good food and strong drink. Then the confusion, the difficulty forming words, the growing realization that something was wrong. Louisa cleared the table with her usual efficiency, stacking plates and gathering silverware while the 5 men struggled to understand what was happening to them. Master Thomas tried to stand and stumbled, his legs betraying him. Master James reached for his wineglass and knocked it over, the red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. "What?" Master William managed, his voice slurring, his eyes wide with the first edge of panic. Louisa looked at him directly then, something she had never done before in his presence. She met his gaze and held it, let him see the 15 years of accumulated hatred burning behind her dark eyes. "Justice," she said simply. Her voice was steady, calm, without a trace of the subservience they had trained into her. My mother's name was Rebecca Washington. My brother's name was Moses. My friend's name was Sarah. Tonight, you're going to learn their names by heart. The rope was already prepared, coiled neatly in the kitchen like a snake waiting to strike. Hemp rope, strong enough to hold a man's weight, long enough to bind 5 sets of hands and feet. She had practiced the knots until she could tie them in complete darkness, until her fingers moved by instinct alone. They tried to resist, but the laudanum had stolen their strength along with their coordination. Master Thomas, who had once broken a man's jaw with his fist, could barely lift his hands to defend himself. Master James, who prided himself on it, his quick wit and quicker reflexes, moved like a man underwater, his thoughts thick and slow as molasses. One by one, she bound them, hands behind their backs, feet together, mouths gagged with strips torn from the same tablecloth where they had eaten their last meal. She worked methodically, checking each knot twice, making sure they were secure but not so tight as to cut off circulation. She needed them alive and aware for what came next. The old well waited in the darkness behind the tool shed, its mouth yawning open like a hungry grave. Louisa had spent the afternoon removing the rotting boards that covered it, checking the stone lining to make sure it would hold. 12 feet deep, 4 feet across, room enough for 5 men if they were arranged properly. She dragged them one by one across the frozen ground, their bodies heavy and uncooperative in her arms. Master Thomas first, because he was the heaviest and would be hardest to move if she waited. She rolled him to the edge of the well and paused, looking down at his face in the moonlight. "This is for my mother," she whispered, and pushed him over the edge. The sound he made hitting the bottom would stay with her forever. Not quite a scream, muffled by the gag, but filled with terror and understanding. The sound of a man realizing that his reign of terror was finally over. Master James was next. The clever one, the one who thought he could calculate his way out of any situation. She could see him trying to work through the mathematics of his predicament, trying to find an angle that would save him. But some equations had only one solution. "This is for Moses," she told him, and sent him down to join his friend in the dark. Master William, who had killed old Ben for the crime of dignity. Master David, who had sold children away from their mothers for profit. Master Samuel, who had taken Rebecca's life and left only blood and broken dreams. This is for Sarah. This is for Ruth. This is for everyone whose name you never bothered to learn. Each body that fell into the well was a weight lifted from her shoulders, a debt marked paid in full. She stood at the edge of the pit, listening to their muffled cries, their desperate attempts to call for help that would never come. The other slaves were in their quarters, the house servants dismissed for the evening. No one would think to look for the masters until morning, and by then it would be far too late. But Louisa wasn't finished yet. She returned to the tool shed and collected the items she had prepared for this moment. Shovels, dirt, stones, the old boards that had covered the well, now ready to serve as a lid for a very different kind of container. She worked by moonlight, moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had spent years planning for this exact moment. The first shovelful of dirt landed with a soft thud on the boards she had laid across the well mouth. She could hear movement below, frantic struggling as the 5 men realized what was happening. They were being buried alive, sealed into the earth like the human refuse they had always considered their slaves to be. Shovelful by shovelful, she covered the boards with soil. The sounds from below grew fainter, more desperate, then gradually faded to silence. The earth was patient, accepting its new burden without complaint. By dawn, the well would be invisible again, just another patch of frozen ground behind the tool shed. As she worked, Louisa spoke their names. All of them. Every slave who had lived and died on this plantation, every child sold away, every woman broken, every man murdered. She spoke them like a prayer, like an incantation, like a promise that they would finally be remembered and honored. Rebecca Washington, Moses Washington, Sarah Jenkins, Ruth Cooper, Ben Harris, Mary Williams, Joseph Brown, Elizabeth Davis. The list went on and on, a litany of the forgotten dead whose only crime had been existing in a world that refused to see them as human. With each name, another shovelful of dirt. With each shovelful, another step toward justice. The work took hours. When she finished, the false dawn was painting the eastern sky pale grey, and her hands were raw despite the thick gloves she wore. But the well was sealed, the evidence buried, the debt paid in full. 5 men who had thought themselves gods had learned what it meant to be powerless, to beg for mercy from someone who had none left to give. Louisa cleaned the shovels and returned them to their places in the tool shed. She washed the rope and coiled it neatly on its hook. She scrubbed her hands until they were pink and tender, removing every trace of earth from under her fingernails. By the time she returned to the plantation house, she looked exactly like what she had always appeared to be, a house slave going about her morning duties. The discovery came at noon, when the masters failed to appear for their planned hunting expedition. The house slaves searched the dining room, the library, the guest quarters, growing increasingly frantic as the hours passed. The wives were summoned from Nashville, the sheriff called from town, neighbors gathered to help with the search. But nobody thought to look behind the tool shed. Nobody suspected the quiet house slave who went about her work with the same methodical efficiency she had always shown. Louisa served coffee to the searchers, answered their questions in her soft, respectful voice, and watched with satisfaction as they looked everywhere except the right place. The official investigation concluded that the 5 men had been murdered by runaway slaves, probably a gang of dangerous fugitives who had been terrorizing the countryside. Rewards were posted, bloodhounds brought in, innocent people questioned and beaten and hanged. But the real perpetrator remained invisible, protected by the same assumptions that had made her crime possible in the first place. Nobody suspected Louisa because nobody truly saw her. She was furniture, property, part of the background landscape of plantation life. The idea that she might have her own thoughts, her own plans, her own capacity for justice was literally unthinkable to the white minds trying to solve the mystery. She lived another 37 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1881, 16 years after emancipation finally made her legally free. She never spoke of what happened that Christmas Eve, never confessed or bragged or hinted at her role in the 5 men's disappearance. She carried her secret like she carried everything else, quietly, patiently, with the dignity of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she had done. But the story survived anyway, passed down through whispered conversations in slave quarters and later in freedmen's settlements. The tale of Louisa May Washington, the woman who served justice along with Christmas dinner, who proved that some debts could only be paid with interest, who showed that patience and planning could accomplish what violence and rebellion never could. The old well remained sealed until 1923, when the plantation was finally sold and new owners decided to clear the land behind the tool shed. What they found confirmed the whispered stories, gave substance to the legend that had grown around Louisa's name. 5 skeletons, still bound with hemp rope, still bearing the marks of their final, terrifying understanding. The discovery made headlines across the South, but by then, most people had forgotten who Thomas Hartwell and James Morrison and the others had been. They were just bones in a hole, anonymous victims of some long-ago violence. But their names were recorded carefully in the coroner's report, preserved for history, along with the date and location of their deaths. December 24th, 1844. Christmas Eve. The night when Louisa May Washington served her masters there, our final meal, and taught them the true meaning of justice. The night when 5 men learned that evil has a price, and sometimes that price comes due when you least expect it. The Hartwell plantation is gone now, turned into suburbs and shopping centers and all the bright, busy monuments to progress that erase the darker chapters of history. But the story endures, carried forward by those who understand that some truths are too important to forget, too powerful to bury permanently. If this story leaves you with questions about justice and revenge, about the price of oppression and the power of patience, it's because Louisa May Washington understood something that her masters never did. That every action has consequences, every cruelty demands payment, and the earth remembers everything we try to forget. Subscribe and share with those who need to remember that the forgotten have names, that the powerless have power, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied.